It began with a single flame, a trembling light that rose quietly against the night air, curling above the iron gates of the French embassy. For a moment, it seemed small, fragile, almost harmless. But within minutes, it grew, breathing, alive, feeding on more than fuel. It was feeding on anger, on exhaustion, on memory. The flame became a mirror, and in it, a nation saw itself. Men, women, the old, the young, they gathered without command, without leader, drawn together by something deeper than politics. It was pain made visible, decades of humiliation turned into heat. No one had planned this. It wasn't a meeting, it was an eruption, a collective exhale from a people who had held their breath too long. The embassy's white walls glowed red, reflecting faces of those who had carried silence like a burden for generations. Some shouted, others simply watched, stunned by their own courage. The air shook with drums, chants, and the crackling of fire that seemed to whisper what no one dared to say aloud. We remember. It wasn't chaos. It was awakening. Because the people of Burkina Faso were not burning their city. They were burning their fear. They weren't destroying, they were reclaiming. Each spark that flew into the night sky carried with it a fragment of something lost. Pride, dignity, and the unspoken truth that no nation can be free when its story is written by someone else. And as the crowd grew, as the night thickened with smoke and song, one name began to ripple through the noise. Soft at first, then louder, carried by hope and defiance alike. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a young soldier, unknown to the world but known instantly to his people. He was not yet power. He was promise, not yet leader, but already symbol. That night, the flame outside the French embassy was not the beginning of violence. It was the end of silence. And from that silence, something ancient stirred, the will of a continent ready to rise again. To understand that night, the night when the sky above Ouagadougou glowed red, you have to travel back through years of exhaustion, through decades of a promise that never arrived. Burkina Faso is a country that has lived through more coups than most people have lived through presidents. Every few years, a new face promised stability, a new uniform promised protection, and a new flag waved over the same old hunger. By 2022, the patience of the people was thin like dry paper waiting for a spark. The country was bleeding from the north. Armed groups, some claiming religion, others chasing profit, carved paths of fear across the Sahel. Entire villages disappeared. Thousands died without names, without cameras, without justice. Over 2 million people fled their homes. For many families, the state itself had vanished, replaced by whispers of militias and by prayers whispered in the dark. The government of Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba had come to power only months before, promising to fix what his predecessor could not. He spoke the language of reform, of partnership with France, of international cooperation, but the people saw no change. Convoys were still ambushed, soldiers were still underpaid, under-equipped, and over-buried. The promise of security became another echo that mocked the living. Then came the rumors, small at first, like sparks in dry grass. That Damiba was being protected by French forces, that French soldiers still moved freely through their bases, taking orders from no one in Ouagadougou, that France had its hands on the gold, the air, and the very breath of Burkina Faso. No one could confirm it. No one could prove it. But in a nation where colonial footprints never faded, you didn't need proof, only memory. People still remembered how France had drawn their borders, how it had controlled their currency through the CFA franc, how every partnership somehow kept the former master in charge. And so, when the radio announced that another coup was underway, the city didn't wait for instructions. It erupted, They came from every direction. Students, workers, street vendors, soldiers off duty. Thousands filled Independence Avenue, carrying flags, drums, and anger that had aged for 60 years. They didn't come for politics. They came for dignity. "We are not slaves," shouted a man, holding his daughter on his shoulders. "We are not your colony," screamed a woman who had lost her husband in the north. As night fell, the embassy lights glared down on them, white and cold, like eyes that refused to blink. And then someone threw the first stone. A window shattered, then another, then fire. Flames began to climb the walls, licking the tricolor emblem that had hung there since the 1960s. People shouted, some wept, some prayed. But no one turned back. In that heat, you could feel something greater than anger. It was release. It was generations of silence breaking open like thunder. To the outside world, it looked like chaos. To those who were there, it felt like clarity. That embassy, for them, was not just a building, it was a ghost, a symbol of a relationship that had always taken more than it gave. Burning it was not an act of hatred toward a nation. It was an act of defiance toward a system. Reporters who came later tried to simplify it: anti-French riots, pro-coup violence, military manipulation. But those who marched knew it was none of that. It was about reclaiming the right to breathe without permission. It was about saying enough in a language that no press conference could mistranslate. Fire. A man who had fought in the old revolution of Thomas Sankara stood near the flames that night. When a journalist asked him what he was seeing, he replied quietly, "I am seeing my son's generation do what we never finished." That sentence captured it all. Burkina's revolution had never ended. It had only been interrupted. The fire outside the French embassy was not destruction. It was continuation. And within that crowd, whispers spread of a new name, a young captain who had led the soldiers that dethroned Damiba. He was not yet famous, not yet myth, but his reputation moved faster than the wind. The one who refused to run, they called him. The one who fights with us, not above us. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. His name passed from mouth to mouth, from phone to phone, until it became chant and conviction. The people didn't yet know what he would become. They only knew what he represented: a return of courage, of authenticity, of leadership born from the soil instead of imported through embassies. That night, the embassy burned. But in the reflection of those flames, the people saw themselves, unafraid, unfiltered, unowned. The fire consumed glass, paper, and paint. But what it truly destroyed was submission. When the smoke cleared, Ouagadougou was different. It smelled like something had ended and something had begun. That was the first fire of Africa's awakening. And it started not with hatred, but with a question whispered to the night: if we do not free ourselves now, when will we? But fire does not rise from nothing. For every flame that lit the embassy walls that night, there were years of invisible smoke building underneath. It wasn't just one spark. It was thousands, buried deep in the lives of farmers who could no longer feed their children, in the lungs of miners who watched gold carted off to Paris while their villages crumbled, in the aching silence of mothers who had lost sons to wars they never understood. This was not sudden. This was sediment, anger, grief, abandonment, pressed together until even the smallest heat could explode it into flame. To the West, it seemed like a mystery. They asked, "Why now?" But the people of Burkina Faso didn't ask that question, because they knew. They had been waiting for this moment their whole lives. Every headline ignored, every contract signed in their name but not in their favor, every time their country was called underdeveloped, while its resources built skyscrapers in foreign cities. It all led here. And more than gold, more than power, it was dignity that had been stripped, quietly, surgically, across decades. They were told to be grateful for aid while their own diamonds paved other nations' wealth. They were promised peace, yet foreign troops stood armed in their soil, not as guests, but as reminders. You are not sovereign. Even their currency was foreign, their leaders monitored, their futures mortgaged before birth. But something had shifted, not in policies, but in perception. The people had begun to see with new eyes. That night, outside the embassy, they were not just opposing France. They were rejecting an entire worldview, a world where Africa exists only to serve, to export, to obey. And what frightened the old powers wasn't the fire itself. It was the clarity inside it. These weren't desperate people. These were awake people. Their rage wasn't blind, it was focused. And in that crowd, you could feel it. No one was waiting for permission. No one was asking for change. They were becoming it. Teenagers stood beside elders, imams embraced priests, soldiers stood down their rifles to sing with civilians. The divisions that had once been exploited melted in the heat of shared awakening, and somewhere between the chants and the flames, something sacred returned: ownership. Burkina Faso was no longer a name given by maps. It was becoming again what its people felt it should be: a nation not managed, but born, not borrowed, but owned. And in that sacred return, the people reached instinctively for someone who had spoken what they felt before they had words for it: Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He wasn't there physically that night, but his presence was everywhere, on their lips, in their minds. In the way they stood straighter, demanded more, expected no less than full sovereignty. Because for the first time, they had seen a leader who didn't speak French to be understood, but spoke truth to be remembered. One who didn't dress for foreign cameras, but for the battlefield his people lived on daily. They saw not a politician, but a reflection. And that, more than anything, was the true spark behind the crowd. Not just anger, but recognition. They looked at each other and said, "We are not alone anymore." In every rising, there is a moment when people stop waiting to be saved and instead start saving each other. That night was Burkina Faso's moment. And in the heartbeat of that crowd, in the thunder of their voices, in the sacred rage of the flames, something irreversible had begun. There are moments in history when a single face becomes more than flesh. It becomes a mirror, a question, a fire. For Burkina Faso, for the continent, for the streets that roared that October night, that face was Captain Ibrahim Traoré. But Traoré was not just a man in uniform. He was the answer to a question Africa had been asking itself for decades. Can we lead ourselves? And not lead politely, with deference to old masters. No, lead with teeth, with pride, with a clear refusal to apologize for wanting the full weight of freedom. In Traoré, they saw the end of dependency dressed as diplomacy. They saw someone who did not bow, who did not whisper, who did not wait for a microphone from Paris to speak his mind. He was not the most senior officer, not the wealthiest, not backed by old generals or Western embassies. What he had was conviction, and that was more dangerous than any army. At just 34 years old, he carried in his eyes not the hesitation of youth, but the impatience of a generation that had waited too long. In him, the people saw a new Africa, unchained not just from Europe, but from fear itself. He didn't speak in cautious declarations. He issued visions. When he talked about sovereignty, it wasn't from a podium surrounded by flags. It was in the trenches, in the gold fields, in the mud, with soldiers who had no boots, but still held the line. He was a soldier who stood where his people bled. And that changed everything. Because Traoré didn't just represent resistance, he represented correction. A correction of history, of stolen timelines, of futures rewritten by foreign textbooks. And when he spoke, it was not just Burkina Faso listening. It was Mali, Niger, Guinea, the Congo, the sons and daughters of Africa, scattered across oceans who had buried their accents to survive. They heard in his voice something terrifyingly beautiful, an end to compromise. He said things that had once gotten people killed. He called out the CFA franc, not just as bad policy, but as economic warfare. He questioned the presence of French troops. Not because of nationalism, but because sovereignty without security is a lie. He rejected debt traps, foreign mining monopolies, and the quiet agreements that turned African soil into open-air vaults for European wealth. And he did it not as a rebel, but as a head of state. That's what made him dangerous. To the West, he was a problem. To his people, he was prophecy, because Traoré walked like someone who remembered something the world hoped Africa had forgotten. That freedom is not given. It is taken. It is defended. It is declared in blood if necessary. And while other leaders dressed in silk to sign deals in foreign capitals, he wore fatigues and walked barefoot through flooded villages, speaking not with rehearsed lines, but with the raw language of accountability. To the young, he was proof the age is not a requirement for vision. To the old, he was redemption. At last, a son who did not sell the house his ancestors died building. He was not perfect, he was not polished, but he was real. And in a continent suffocated by diplomacy that sounds good but delivers nothing, real was revolutionary. So when the flames rose outside the French embassy, they weren't just flames of anger. They were flames of belief that maybe, finally, Africa had a lion among its own again. Not one trained in foreign zoos, but one born wild, unashamed, roaring not for power, but for the land, for the people, for the silence that had gone on too long. And the world watched with narrowed eyes, because symbols are contagious, and Traoré was no longer a man, he was a match, and Africa was dry wood. The West did not sleep that night, screens lit up in Paris, Washington, Brussels, not with headlines, but with alarms. Something had cracked. Not in the embassy's stone walls, but in the illusion that Africa could be controlled indefinitely. The fire wasn't just burning on African soil, it was burning through policy memos, investment plans, military agreements, the quiet contracts signed in back rooms where no Burkinabe voice had ever been heard. First came the silence, a vacuum, a pause, that tense moment before a storm. Then, the headlines, the reports, the familiar script. Violent protesters, unstable junta, populist leader, threat to democracy. As if the same lips that applauded coups backed by oil contracts now wept for constitutions they'd never respected. They called the movement anti-Western. They called Traoré a strong man. They called the uprising chaotic, but they never called it what it truly was, inevitable. Because in truth, it wasn't the embassy that frightened them. It was the clarity of the people's eyes outside its gates. These were not looters. These were not mobs. These were citizens, awakened, informed, and unafraid. And that terrified the architects of empire more than any rifle. They scrambled, behind closed doors. Western ambassadors requested emergency briefings. Intelligence cables flew across continents. "Who is Traoré, really?" they asked. "How deep is his support? Can we contain him? Who funds him?" They whispered about Russian influence, Iranian propaganda, Wagner shadows, anything to explain the revolt without facing the truth. Africa had begun to think for itself, and that is always the West's greatest fear. Aid was threatened, investment reconsidered, military cooperation paused. It was a script older than independence itself: reward obedience, punish resistance, call the latter extremism. But this time, the old tricks didn't work, because the people no longer feared being isolated. They had already been isolated for decades. What they feared was silence, and they would not return to it. France, in particular, watched the events in Burkina Faso like a fever dream. Just months earlier, they had faced expulsion in Mali, then Niger. Now Ouagadougou burned with the same fire, the same chants, the same flag burning in front of embassies once untouchable. The empire had no clothes, and for the first time, the world was watching. Journalists were deployed. Talking heads flooded the airwaves. They tried to paint Traoré as a puppet, a radical, a temporary glitch in a system too old to fail. But with every attack, they only proved how threatened they truly were. Because deep down, they knew. This was not just Burkina Faso. This was a contagion, and its name was self-determination. The geopolitical maps, drawn in ink centuries ago, were starting to smudge, and no amount of development partnerships or photo ops with staged African summits could redraw them fast enough. So the strategy shifted. If they couldn't win the minds of Africans, they would try to confuse them, divide them, offer deals to the compliant, sanctions to the bold, co-opt the elites, flood social media with disinformation, whisper to old generals, stir up tribal lines, spin the flames of protest into foreign plots. But the problem was no longer political. It was spiritual. What had changed in Burkina Faso that night was not policy. It was posture. The people were no longer kneeling, and that posture is irreversible. It started in Ouagadougou, a wall of flame against a stone embassy. But fire, real fire, does not stay where it begins. It searches, it hungers, it moves with wind and belief. And this fire was not of wood and cloth. It was made of memory, of anger, of recognition. So it moved. First to Mali, not with weapons but with whispers. Young men in Bamako watching footage on cracked phones, eyes wide, hearts racing. Traoré did what we all thought impossible. Then to Niger, still trembling from its own awakening. They're rising too, voices echoed in Niamey markets. It wasn't just us. In the gold fields of Guinea, in the shipping ports of Togo, in the underground economy of Benin, the videos spread, not as news, but as proof. Proof that the chains could be seen. And if they could be seen, they could be broken. And in Paris, in New York, in London, the African diaspora watched with tears and clenched fists. In barbershops and churches and WhatsApp groups, the same question burned. Is this it? Is this finally the break? Traoré's name began to appear not just in headlines, but in murals, in memes, in songs, in graffiti, across neglected neighborhoods where sons of Africa had been told to be quiet, to behave, to assimilate. They didn't. They stood taller, because back home, someone was roaring on their behalf. In South Africa, students marched with Traoré's face on banners. In Ghana, elders spoke his name with a reverence they hadn't felt in decades. In Brazil, Afro-descendant communities invoked his speeches during land rights protests. In Haiti, rappers referenced his defiance in new tracks, blending Creole and resistance in every beat. The fire spread through algorithms, through group chats, through whispers between mothers and sons at dinner tables. Look what they did in Burkina. Maybe we can too. And the fire didn't just inspire. It terrified the complacent. Old presidents who once walked safely now looked over their shoulders. Ministers who signed away land for French contracts now fumbled for excuses. Generals once loyal to old orders began to recalculate, because a fire that burns long enough starts to melt masks. Across Africa, people began to ask, why is our uranium lighting up French cities while we sit in the dark? Why do our riches make Europe richer while our hospitals rot? Why is the West always worried when we choose our leaders, but silent when they are chosen for us? These were not new questions, but this time they were being asked out loud, in streets, in schools, in song, in rage, in hope, and every time a flag of a former colonial power was burned, it wasn't out of hate. It was a funeral, a burial, of hypocrisy, of silence, of forced gratitude for stolen centuries. This was not about revenge. It was about resurrection. Burkina Faso had lit a match, and now the continent was glowing, not with destruction, but with vision. A vision where Africa didn't need saviors, didn't need lectures, didn't need permission, just space. And for the first time in generations, Africa began to believe that space was theirs to take.